Hello and welcome to the SMU Video Archive series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their particular time at the university. I'm Travis Jordan, and today we have with us Wilson Snodgrass, who was a librarian for many years at SMU and ended his career as Associate Library of the Central University Library System here. I am particularly pleased, Wilson, to have the opportunity for us to have this conversation today because I've always been an admirer of you both professionally and personally, impeccable in your role in the libraries at SMU, and I always felt good that we had some things going there. So you spent 38 years, almost 38 years,
yes, almost
at SMU in the library system, which comprises almost the total sum of your professional career, almost, given over to the university. How did you happen to get here in the first place?
Well, I'll backtrack just a tiny bit and say my first day of work was August 3rd, 1959.
I hope you got the day, okay.
I know the exact day. It's embedded in memory. Prior to coming here, I had worked as a cataloger for 3 years at Texas Western College in El Paso, now better known as the University of Texas at El Paso, but then it was Texas Western College. Prior to that, I had been in El Paso as a member of the U.S. Army Medical Corps with, believe it or not, an assignment to the medical library of William Beaumont Army Hospital. Now, my knowledge of the SMU libraries predates all of that. As long ago as 1953, I had served a brief internship in Fondren Library to fulfill one of the degree requirements for my Master of Library Science degree from the University of Texas at Austin. Now, I should add something else that you may not know. Librarians were very scarce in the 1950s and 60s. When libraries had vacancies, directors went to any lengths imaginable to fill those. So the moment I got my degree, I had a telephone call from the director of libraries at SMU, Max Trent, offering me a position. I had to this was in 1954. I had to turn him down because I had 2 years of military service intervening. Oh. After the military service, I wanted to stay in El Paso a while, so I took the position at Texas Western College. About once a year, Max would contact me and say, "We have an interesting opening we'd like for you to think about." Finally, in 1959, I accepted. I accepted and came here.
Well, it sounds like they were persistent in getting you here, and I'm glad they were persistent and that you yielded. You started off as a cataloger.
Yes.
But you undoubtedly have gone on to many, as is the case when you spend that long on a university, to do many things. What kind of an evolution have you had in your profession?
Well, a lot of things happened. The first year I was here, I was a cataloger. The second year, I was head of the catalog department. After about 7 or 8 years, I think probably in 1969, with the retirement of the head of technical services, which included acquisitions and cataloging, I succeeded to that position in the library.
Both?
Yes. So I was head of the technical services area. We later renamed technical services processing services. I think we were emulating the Library of Congress, which called its similar operation by that name. So I was head director of processing services. Somewhere over the years, I became something of a deputy to the librarian. So I acquired a second title of Associate University or Associate Central University Librarian. During a never-to-be-forgotten final year of service, I had those 2 positions, plus I was acting as systems librarian, while the systems librarian we had gone on to another position, and we were recruiting for a replacement. I had an extremely busy final year.
Maybe that contributed to it being your final year. I don't know.
It's quite possible.
Well, the libraries are significantly different today than they were in 1959. What kind of what did you find when you got here as a young librarian in 1959?
Well, let me talk first about physical facilities and buildings. There was Fondren Library, sitting where Fondren Library is right now. There was Bridwell Library in the Perkins School of Theology quadrangle. There was the Law Library, rather shoehorned into space in Story Hall. Over in this very McFarland auditorium was the School of Music, where there was a small collection of music scores and audio recordings. Essentially, that was it at that time. There was really no sense of there being a library system. Max Trent, as I mentioned earlier, was known as the director of libraries. He had rather loose coordination, administrative responsibilities for those 3 libraries. Bridwell, though, reported then, as it does now, to the dean of the theology school. A similar situation exists with the law library. So that's basically what I found at the time I came. I think it's...
In buildings, you say that Fondren was essentially as it is now. Had they already built the large extension over to the east? No. So it was just the original 1930?
It was the original 1940 Fondren Library. Yes, that's correct. It's probably worth mentioning that before Fondren Library was built, the library facilities, as they were crammed into Dallas Hall prior to 1940. The library was in Dallas Hall somewhere. I've never seen the space. That was a little bit before my time. Bridwell Library was in Kirby Hall. And I believe you or someone said to me that indeed the whole theology school was at Kirby Hall at one point before the Perkins quadrangle was constructed.
That's correct. I believe the whole school and the library were in the building.
Yes.
So it works out there. Well, when did the libraries, I know your association has been primarily with the Central University Libraries, but when did the libraries begin to grow on campus and expand? If this is what you found in 1959, what kind of an evolution have we had in the...
Well, a fairly systematic one, particularly as regards buildings. At the time I came, there were already plans underfoot for a Science Information Center to be constructed north of Fondren Library. In fact, that building may have been under construction at the time I came to work. I simply don't quite remember that. The building opened in around 1961. The basement and the first 2 floors were occupied by a science and engineering library. The 3rd floor was used for some other purposes, including a few years later, temporary housing for the DeGolyer Library. The collection, I'll mention that since we're on the Science and Engineering Library, the collection in that building was drawn substantially from the collection in Fondren Library.
Just moved it over there.
Yes. Books in the relevant scientific and engineering fields were simply pulled from the Fondren stacks and transferred over to science and engineering.
Was the reason for spreading out mainly space, or was there some reason to divide the libraries along academic discipline areas?
I think both of those statements would be true, Travis. As you probably know, the Science Information Center was funded by leading Dallas industrialists who were quite interested in seeing that facility developed on this campus.
It's always had some relationship to a wider community as well.
Yes, that is right. That is right.
Emphasis and research and development, and that kind of thing to do there. And similar sorts of things, I suppose, as other libraries expanded and developed, it was partly because of the growing in the discipline, I guess, or the attention, or the money that comes along to support these kinds of things.
I should mention, too, that at some point we began to feel a greater need to support library needs in the arts school here. The Owen Arts Center opened in the early 1960s. In that school was a small music library which consisted of the scores and recordings I've already mentioned that were in McFarland, plus some materials from Fondren, which were moved over into a music library within Owen. There was also a fine arts reading room, which was rather curiously administered, and it was under the oversight of the art school itself, whereas Fondren Library was directly responsible for the music library. It was not until quite a bit later, we get into the 80s, and I think the building actually opened in 1990, that the Hammond Arts Center was built.
Oh, yeah.
And all of the library materials for the arts were consolidated in that structure. And of course, the Hammond is an essential component of the Central University libraries, as you know.
We've been talking about the Central University libraries. What is that concept? When did it happen? And what's it composed of now?
Well, originally, when the concept was formalized around 1977, we had Fondren Library, we had the Science and Engineering Library, DeGolyer Library, an interesting little collection in the Heroy building called the Institute for the Study of Earth and Man Library. We had the Music Library in the Owens Center. As the years passed, the Hammond Arts Library came along. Even before that happened, the annex to Fondren Library, known as Fondren Library East, was constructed. I think that was dedicated about 1969.
Was that just to accommodate growth of collection?
Yes, yes. Fondren had just sadly outgrown space, and it was absolutely necessary to expand some way. So we had an enlarged Fondren, also in that basic CUL component. Ultimately, we had Hammond. Eventually, as of course you know, the Norwich Center for Media and Instructional Technology became a unit under the administrative oversight of the libraries.
When technology became important in video libraries.
I should emphasize through all of this that Bridwell and Law stayed outside that orbit and continued with their original administrative and reporting structures, as I had initially noted.
But everything else relates to the Central University Library.
Yes, that's correct.
You mentioned a couple of libraries that probably are not known by some people very much. One of them is the DeGolyer Library, and the other one, the
Institute for the Study of Earth and Man, the ISEM Library.
ISEM, yeah.
Well, dealing with that one first, because it's smaller and perhaps a little easier, it's simply composed of a lot of basic material in anthropology and archaeology to support course offerings in those particular academic disciplines here. The DeGolyer Library, of course, is the very famous special collection which the late Everett DeGolyer Sr., then Everett DeGolyer Jr. built and developed, which focuses on history of the, particularly history of the American West, but it's branched out to include archival holdings of such people as Earl Cabell and Stanley Marcus. And I think in recent years, the DeGolyer Library subsumed responsibility for university archives, in fact. So obviously its holdings are much broader in scope than initially. It's a very well-known special collection, and it's visited by scholars from all over the country, indeed perhaps the world.
Throughout all this, then, what we now know, I know now, as processing services was taking on work for the entire Central University complex. So that the ordering of books and the cataloging and the placing and all that.
For each of those units.
That's been quite a rapid expansion at the time.
It was a rapid expansion. The workload was heavy. The staff was sometimes too small. But somehow we did it. We had people who were dedicated to what they were doing, who wanted to do a good job, and I think the results were generally quite fine.
Staffing is an issue that might be worth going into. When you came here, I'm sure there was a small staff, but how has the staff changed in the libraries over the years since you've been around?
When I came, the staff probably included in Fondren, which was basically all we had for my first couple of years. The staff couldn't have been larger than 24 people.
For everything?
For everything. It was almost entirely a female staff, which I think was quite true in libraries over the country at that time. I was one of the few male members of the staff for several years, in fact. Obviously, as we added new physical facilities, the staff had to grow so that we could manage the service points those new facilities were opening up for the campus. I think those of us with a long history in the libraries realized the staff never really grew quite enough. I was interested in reading the current director's annual report where she made some reference to staff as a great asset, and she added the comment, of course, that the staff, for not very much money, does an outstanding job in meeting all of the needs of its users. And that was true then. I think it's still true. To its credit, the university administration recognizes the fact that the staff is not large enough, that in some aspects the staff is underpaid, and I think concentrated efforts are made to, concerted efforts are being made to do something about that.
What about, is it true maybe that the professional nature of the staff has changed? It's my impression that it used to be that no one could work in the library without a library degree, but is that still the case?
It's probably not entirely the case. I think still people who have vacancies like to add the magic phrases to position descriptions that a Library of Science degree from a school accredited by the American Library Association is, perhaps now they would say preferred rather than required, or some such statement as preferred with an or relevant experience. I know certainly some libraries, I'm not sure I can speak for SMU since I've been away now practically 5 years, some libraries are bringing in information technology specialists in positions where we once felt we had to have a bona fide reference librarian and no one else.
Are there more just non-professional support people in the staff than there were perhaps in the beginning?
I think that's always true. I think ratios of support staff to professionals have perhaps not changed a great deal. Certainly here we had, I would judge one professional for each 2 or 3 support staff, and that is probably true today. Whether that's ideal, I'm not sure in view of what the present workload may be.
In talking about the staff, and having been around for 38 years, you must have known a lot of interesting people and important people in the development and the bringing of the library system, particularly Central University libraries where it is today. Going back to when you first got here, but I'd be interested even as you look down the long road, who are some of the people that you remember and would talk about and think deserves a place in the SMU history for one reason or another?
And people I will never forget.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned the 3 main library buildings when I came. Lois Bailey was the librarian of Fondren Library. She had taken the place, although no one really took her place, Dorothy Amon, well known as the first librarian of SMU. I believe Lois was actually the second in terms of the position in Fondren.
So she was the second?
I think in terms of the position in Fondren, Lois was the second. At Bridwell we had Deckard Turner, very well known, particularly in the area of special collections. In the law library, we had Hibernia Turbeville.
A woman?
Yes, a woman.
In the law library, that's interesting.
Yes, a woman who had the great respect of the Dallas legal community, apparently. I've already mentioned Max Trent, who was known as Director of Libraries in that era. Oh, there are so many other people I'd like to mention, and I don't want to intentionally slight anyone.
Yeah.
But who could forget Genevieve Porter as the longtime head of reference? Her associate Ann Bailey in periodicals, Elizabeth Glob at the circulation desk, my boss in technical services, Doris Clower. These were key staff members at that time.
Everybody that you mentioned that I know personally spent many, many years at SMU.
That is right. These were long years of service in every instance.
And the fact that the first librarian was still here in 1959 is that's intriguing. So the dedication and the commitment and the kind of preserving of tradition, if you will, which is not always the best, but certainly in this case, I think has lots of good qualities about it.
Yes. There were other people. At Bridwell, there was Kate Warnick, who was at least nominally the librarian for the Methodist Historical Collection. I suspect Kate was a great deal more than that in reality. And if I'm not mistaken, her tenure at Bridwell represents almost the longest tenure any staff member at SMU has ever had. It's an extremely long period of service. And I'm sorry I didn't check that before our conversation today, because it would be astounding, I believe.
I think she worked into her 80s, maybe.
Yes, she did. She worked a very long time.
And
Paige Thomas was at Bridwell as a cataloger when I came. Paige Thomas is still at Bridwell today,
yeah.
with indeed more responsibilities than simply cataloging.
Interesting. So it's the gifts of people like that that have kind of helped move things.
Yes.
And don't leave yourself out of that as well. But
There was a lot of cooperation too, particularly at the level of technical services among these units. You probably will remember that access to library collections in those days was through card catalogs.
Yes.
Fondren Library had the largest card catalog of all. We termed it a union catalog. Do you know what that means, Travis?
Vaguely, yeah, where it's supposed to represent all the holdings.
That's right. The catalog in Fondren was it theoretically represented the holdings of all the campus libraries, including Bridwell and Law. But since we at no point did cataloging for Law and had not always cataloged for Bridwell, we had to rely on their staffs to supply us records for the union catalog. So it was probably not 100% accurate, but it was the best we could do at that time, and certainly it was better than not having a union catalog.
Other than getting into technology, which I don't want to do right now, has cataloging changed over the years? The rules of cataloging?
Enormously. It's something that only a cataloger could really appreciate, probably.
Well, those of us who use the library should appreciate it,
yes,
too.
Yes, rules have certainly changed. The famous Anglo-American cataloging rules, known as AACR, have impacted cataloging worldwide, actually. Cataloging online, which we can get into a little bit later, using automated technology, is a major change.
But it's still taken very seriously, I think, and has always been.
Yes, yes,
and
indeed.
Rules are followed, and there's a quality control that probably is rare in many professions.
Yes.
You know, that go through there. We've been talking about the collections, and I think I'm right in saying that the library collections, if you take them as a whole at SMU, are probably amongst the largest in the entire state of Texas right now.
Yes.
How does that compare to your beginning
Well,
days?
we think right now that only the University of Texas at Austin and Texas A&M libraries have more volumes and are held on the SMU campus.
We're right up there towards the top.
At the time I came, I'm not certain about numerical rankings. Certainly there were only a few 100,000 volumes in all of the campus libraries in 1959.
That's astounding.
Yeah, no, that all-important milestone, the 1 millionth volume, was added in 1969 concurrently with dedication of the annex to Fondren Library East, which we mentioned earlier. The 1 millionth volume was added then. I noticed in the current director's latest annual report that she is suggesting that as of June 2001, the central libraries have 1.9 million volumes. I'm not certain of holdings at Bridwell and Underwood at this point, but certainly that would boost the total considerably.
So we're likely then over the 2 million already?
Yes. And just in passing, while on statistics there, Jillian McComb says there are 79 staff members in Central University libraries.
I was wondering if you had any idea what the current staff
79 is the current standard.
As compared
there.
to a dozen, yeah.
Something I somehow overlooked as we were going through this sort of roughshod chronology. Bridwell and Laud also had some physical expansion. We talked about what happened with Fondren and the central libraries and so forth, but in the mid-1980s, the then director of Bridwell, Robert Malloy, was instrumental in having an extensive renovation and expansion of Bridwell Library. I would say the mid-1980s. It must have been in the early 1970s that the law library finally got adequate quarters when the Underwood Law Library on the northwest corner of the campus was built and dedicated. So those were major events for those two collections.
And then you've already mentioned the new Hammond
Yes,
library when they expanded there. So in square footage, it would be enormous how much more space the library collection takes up.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the annex to Fondren because it shows how interwoven things are on this campus.
Yeah, I've always found that interesting.
When the Fondren annex opened, it then as now consisted of a basement and 4 floors. The library was given occupancy of the basement and the first 2 floors only. The 3rd and 4th floors were reserved for non-library purposes. The first of those being the entire staff of Perkins administration moved into the 3rd and 4th floors. In fact, we had President Willis Tate on the 4th floor of that annex.
That was the administrative offices in the library.
As Perkins administration was being renovated.
Okay.
In fact, the only part of the old Fondren that we really kept for our own was the central stack core, you know, that 8-level.
Where the books were housed.
Yes, where the books were. That was kept as the central stack core. I think the registrar's office somehow was in the first floor of the old Fondren where Media Services is now. It took quite a few years before all of that space was returned for library use. Once the Perkins people moved out, the development office remained behind on the 4th floor. We had the math department and the Southwestern Graduate School of Banking on the 3rd floor. I suspect it was about 20 years before all of that space reverted to Fondren Library.
In fact, I remember the economics department being down in the basement.
Yes, it was in the basement.
Yeah.
The existing original Fondren Library had a lot of renovation, and somewhere during all that process, adequate space, or at least handsome space, I don't really think it's adequate in terms of size, was developed for the DeGolyer Library.
Yes, yes.
And then, of course, you know about the move of Media Services into the 1st floor and the basement of that building.
And it finally became a legitimate child of a library.
Yes, that's correct.
As times change. That probably is a nice segue into getting into some of the technological changes in the library. But before we get into that, is anything else we need to say about either the facilities or the staff or the collection of the libraries as we compare that 40 years in
I don't mean to omit what we might call the missing link, but that is the new structure which opened in 1998, which physically connects Fondren and the Science and Engineering Library.
That's right. Yeah.
That was proposed years ago, put aside, forgotten, proposed again, put aside, eventually approved by the Board of Trustees and funded and built. That's extremely significant, Travis, because it allowed some consolidation of collections and user services from Fondren and Science Engineering.
It also makes a statement that I always found troubling in the libraries, that there is an entrance, a proper entrance to the library, and a circulation area and some things that the East Wing, or as I call it, was always a little bit problematical about.
Students who are new to the campus are probably still perplexed that there is this monumental entrance with columns to something said to be Fondren Library.
Yeah.
But they must walk to the north now and go into Fondren Library Center to enter the library property. Otherwise, they're in the DeGolyer Library.
The monumental entrance to the library reminds me that I call it's sort of like the Aida set to the opera Aida.
Yes.
You know, these steps and steps and steps going up there. But I think that also helped in the early days to set a kind of formal atmosphere for the libraries, and And I want you to tell us that wonderful story about Lois Bailey and the treatment, how she viewed the way that people should dress properly to be a part, to enter the library.
Yes, well, it actually went beyond Lois because it probably was a uniform campus dress code requirement. Yeah. But female students and or faculty could not enter any building on this campus wearing slacks, no matter how nicely tailored these might be, representing pantsuits.
Just unwomanly.
Yes, it was just something that was not done. And I remember one afternoon a faculty member was standing at the card catalog engaged in research, and she was dressed very smartly in trousers. And Lois came out of her office and just politely asked her if she would please leave and come back when she was dressed appropriately. And that was simply accepted for the time. The woman apologetically closed her notebooks and left. No legal action was taken.
Yeah, no big article in the daily campus newspaper.
That's correct. That's correct.
We touched on this earlier, but I'd like to visit in a similar vein how even in 1959 librarians were largely female and not many men. That has changed, has it not? And why do you think that it has changed?
It has changed to a certain extent. I don't know that it has changed as much in librarianship as possibly some other professions. Curiously, though, looking back, reading library histories, it seemed to be more or less customary or traditional that men held the key leadership positions, especially in university libraries in those early years. It was rather unusual to have a female library director. I'm not certain any of the Ivy League campuses, for instance,
so it's okay
had
to be a
female
director.
It was all right for the directors to be male, but not female. Today, that's changed a great deal. At least, the glass ceiling, perhaps, is not there quite as much for female librarians as out in the business world. I'm not really answering your question.
Well, I don't know if there is an answer, but it's somebody who may get this material someday may look into this whole thing about the sexes.
Oh, yes.
It used to be, I think, that because of the great attention to detail and almost obsessiveness about being accurate and so forth was a womanly thing, and now then we see that most or many computer people are male, and that's a very similar kind of discipline that goes in there. Just the mixing up that goes on there. Something else has crossed my mind that I'd like to ask if you even have an opinion about the use of the libraries. Do you think that students and faculty or faculty make more or less use of library material than they did 40 years ago?
4 years ago, I was still in the library. My sense then was, just simply because I don't think that all dorm rooms were wired with computers and internet access at every desk, I think library use was very heavy then from students and faculty. From what I hear from colleagues with whom I'm still in touch now, I suspect some of this is dropping off because a lot of students think they can search the World Wide Web, the internet, in the privacy of their rooms and find the material they need.
Or think they need.
Or think they need. I'm not personally convinced they really find the right material either, but of course that's another story.
And it used to be a major function of librarians to assist students and faculty in finding the right material and helping them do research. I remember often going into the library and librarians would knock themselves out, to help me find some strange little bit of information that only a mother could love.
They still will do that too, provided the students make their needs known and ask the right questions of the librarian.
But that provides us, I guess, with a good entree into that section in which we both recognize that technology has probably had the greatest impact on libraries and information in general of anything that has ever come along. And I think it's way too early to evaluate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It just is.
Yes.
And so what kinds of changes are
Lots
we talking
lots
about?
of changes over just my tenure here, and probably more change and at a more rapid clip since I left. As I emphasized at the beginning, this was a very traditional library operation when I came. Something I did not say is that Fondren even had closed stacks, meaning that...
Oh, really?
Yes, Fondren had closed stacks, meaning that the circulation desk staff would secure materials for people.
You just told them what book you wanted.
Yes,
and you said, go
that's
get
right.
it.
Only some graduate students and faculty had permission to go through that miraculous swinging gate that barred them from the stacks and the book collection in Fondren. Probably it was the opening of the science library, which has been an open stack collection from the first day. That was probably the catalyst which inspired us to open the stacks in Fondren, because we opened stacks in Fondren very rapidly after that. That, of course, isn't great technological change, although as traditional as we were at the time, it probably seemed like a big step
Well, but it
forward.
relates to technology, because one of the things that users of technology appear to like best today is that they have access to all the information, too much information
Yes.
probably, but they're not barred from any of it if they know how to get to it.
That's correct. That's correct. Well, we opened the stacks. The next major step for us was what was almost a sudden decision to make a change from using the Dewey Decimal classification system for books to using the Library of Congress system.
And why was that?
We were realizing that most academic librarians had been using the Library of Congress, we'll call that LC for short, had been using the LC classification for years. It's a better, more logically expandable classification for large collections. So we made an abrupt change in the 1960s to suddenly start adding all new materials to the collections in the Library of Congress scheme.
That's the little numbers that appear on the back of the book to tell you how to find them.
That's right. That's the call number on the spine, the call number on the bibliographic record. It's the location device.
Yeah.
It further serves to locate materials among similar materials on the shelves. All of the books on a particular subject, or at least theoretically, kept together by the classification number. Facilitates browsing in open stacks, of course. We made the change to do that. Of course, the immediate question from faculty was, what are you going to do about the thousands, the hundreds of thousands of volumes that still have Dewey numbers on them? Well, we had a small staff. We realized we could not possibly go back and reclassify every book that we had. So we devised a scheme with the circulation desk. Every day the circulation desk would receive books back from circulation. They would look at those, and books which appeared to be used more heavily than others, I think we set a limit of perhaps 100 books per day. Those books could be sent back to us to be reclassified into the Library of Congress numbers. We got a little bit of grant money. We hired a few supplemental staff members, and we worked rather diligently at that for at least 5 or 6 years. And I suspect we got most of what we would term the circulating collection reclassified. Now, if you go into the Fondren stacks today, you still find materials classified by Dewey Decimal numbers. I like to tell myself that those are lesser used and older materials, and it's not terribly important. However, they are represented in the catalogs for the collection,
But
so they're certainly available.
They live physically in a different place.
Yes, they live physically apart from the others. That was really quite a major change.
Yeah.
An even more staggering change for us in technical services came in 1973. In conjunction with several other libraries, academic libraries, and the Dallas Public Library, I believe, in North Texas, we signed a contractual agreement with the Ohio College Library Center in Ohio to have online access to the database of bibliographic records maintained at OCLC.
This was 73.
1973.
Wow.
We had dedicated telephone lines connecting computer terminals in the catalog department, which were certainly the first computer terminals in the library anywhere, connected to that database at OCLC. This was considered quite revolutionary. We could search that database on these terminals from, we would have a book in hand that needed cataloging or processing. We could retrieve a bibliographic record in that database on the screen. We could give it our call number if we so desired, if there was not a number there that was acceptable. We could change that record in any way we wanted. OCLC was keeping a permanent magnetic tape record of all of these transactions for us. And each night, massive printers at OCLC would print catalog cards for each day's output, which would be sent to us. See, we were still maintaining the traditional card catalog, but we were actually producing those records via a computer.
On a computer.
Well, obviously, after doing that for quite a few years, it was apparent to us that we really should try to get to the point where we could do something with those magnetic tape records in Ohio. We knew that other libraries, including some in North Texas, were starting to extract those tapes from OCLC, load them into computer systems on their campuses, and they could serve as the basis for an online catalog of library holdings. I'm not sure the university administration, and there's no reflection on people then, I'm not sure the administration really appreciated the significance of that or the importance particularly younger staff members were associating with being able to do something like that.
Couldn't look ahead that far.
I had some very restless staff members who were very eager to move ahead.
Yeah.
While I was not ready to scrap all of our manual systems, which had served us well for many years, I could certainly see that there were many ways in which we could make progress. Many of us were in some despair that this was ever going to happen. We would go to meetings of our colleagues in other libraries in North Texas, and we would come back very disappointed because the SMU representatives could not get up and say, we're doing all of these wonderful things with our OCLC archival tapes. Enter an ally at Bridwell Library, Jerry Campbell, who was the director of Bridwell after Deckard Turner left for the University of Texas at Austin. Jerry knew that we should get moving on this project. He had an uncanny gift for writing grant proposals in a hurry. He was able to get significant grant funding for us so that we could tackle this project called, are you ready for this, retrospective conversion.
I would like
Have you heard the term?
Yes, yes.
Retrospective conversion consisted of looking at old catalog records on catalog cards, matching those with the online bibliographic records in OCLC, indicating to OCLC by putting our holding symbol there that we own that book. Now that's obviously a very labor-intensive procedure. We used Jerry's grant money to hire a full-time supervisor of retrospective conversion, who in turn was authorized to hire part-time staff who came into our catalog department in the evenings when we were not working and proceeded to work through our catalog records to update the OCLC
And what was the
tapes.
perceived need to do that? Why were you doing that?
Well, the more of this that could be done, the closer we would be put to the point when we could have a real online automated catalog.
For ourselves.
For ourselves. This process continued over a period of several years. It did not include only holdings in the Central University Libraries, but titles held in Bridwell and Underwood. The conversion team worked in both of those locations as well as in the basement of Fondren Library. By this time, the administration was becoming more sympathetic to the notion of having a fully integrated automated library system. Funding was being sought through various grant agencies. I suppose it must have been the mid-1980s, perhaps late. Dates are becoming increasingly meaningless to me at this point, that a position was authorized to hire an automation librarian. Carolyn Cassina came to us from a University of California campus. As soon as Carolyn got here, she sized up the magnitude of the task of getting these libraries to that particular point where we had the integrated library system. She immediately appointed staff members to probably as many as a dozen task forces to address different aspects of this change. Some people worked on site information in the buildings. This was very crucial. The buildings were not adequately wired to support terminals and computer networks at all.
Right. Yeah.
We had the unpleasant discovery of asbestos in ceiling tiles in older parts of buildings. There were just many problems that had to be overcome. Somehow it all came together over a period of just 3 or 4 years. We looked at the offerings of several library vendors. We settled on that offered by a firm under the name Notice, N-O-T-I-S. Notice was actually originally a proprietary system for Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. However, it became marketable to academic libraries in particular, and many libraries seized the opportunity to acquire the Notice software and programming. We did. We had OCLC extract all of our bibliographic records from its database. Those had to go through some extensive processing with some other vendors. But by about 1990, as I recall, we actually had computer terminal access at public service points in the campus libraries of basically all the library holdings on this campus.
I remember the button that was popular online in '89. We didn't make it in '89.
I think we made it the next year, actually.
Yeah.
Notice was a very good system in its day. In addition to first providing us with the automated catalog, we eventually had an acquisition system using Notice.
For new books?
Yes, to actually order materials and to even do financial accounting and payment tracking through Notice. We had a circulation system, which of course was one of the most problematic things of all, but indeed we had circulation finally through Notice.
Find out who hadn't turned their books in.
That's right. That was a very complex module of the system, but it did work. Leaping ahead just a little bit, by about 1995, it became apparent that even this technology was changing a lot. We were seeing what some other institutions who had not selected Notice were doing with other automated systems, and we began to think that perhaps it was time for us to consider a change. In 1996, Carolyn Casino left us for a library directorship at East Texas State University in Commerce. We had already begun having visits from vendors of other systems and looking at those. We were writing an RFP, which we would eventually submit. That was the point at which I was pressed into yeoman service as acting systems librarian while we recruited a replacement for Carolyn. Ultimately, we were successful in attracting Mary Carews from the Dallas Public Library, where she had been responsible for automation there, to SMU. Mary is still here. She was here in time to oversee the change to the new system, which is called Voyager, produced by a company known as Endeavor, rather curiously perhaps made up of many former Notice staff members. Also of interest perhaps is that Voyager is a system chosen by the Library of Congress as its automated system.
That's the one we're using now.
The one we're using now.
We call it Pony, but that really
Yes,
is
the Pony is the campus name for
right.
the information system itself.
Indeed.
So it's been an exciting, quite a quarter century really, on the automation road.
Do you feel confident that we were able, through all this, I just find that staggering, to maintain integrity of the collection and the information and bring all the books that we have, and we now have an integrated online library system?
It is an impressive achievement, and many staff members have worked long and hard to bring this about.
Well, it's not likely that many people would, in their career, have experienced the kind of change and growth and development that you and those of your colleagues along with you have experienced in that period. But there must be considerable pride of achievement in doing that, and the university, I think, is undoubtedly a much richer, sounder, more academically viable place than it was certainly today. The information is more accessible, don't you think, than it has ever been? And
I feel we're not lagging behind in any significant areas.
That is an achievement in itself.
Yes.
That's there. Wilson, it's been delightful to spend some time together. I wonder, though, if there's anything else you feel like we need to, that we haven't, there's many things we haven't covered. There's a lot of things, but in a small amount of time that's here, I think we've covered the fact that the library system at SMU has always been strong, but probably is as strong today as it has ever been in the history of the university. And our thanks go out to all those people, those you've mentioned and those we haven't had time to mention.
No, I can't mention everyone. I would like to.
Had a part to be there. And so we thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing how the library system continues in the future.
I've enjoyed talking with you, Travis. Thank you.